Hello, my name is John Walter, instructor for English 302, sections M01 and M03, and in this lecture I'm going to cover the week's readings from the Craft of Research and introduce the concept of disciplinarity and how it helps shape practices of writing and research. Before discussing the book itself, I want to note that my lectures about the readings from the Craft of Research are not going to be so much summaries of the readings, but instead I'm going to kind of just pick out some key concepts, point them out, and offer some examples and kind of extend the ideas in the book. The reason for this is that the textbook is written to be both straightforward and accessible to undergraduate students such as yourself, and therefore my assumption is that for the most part you will all be able to just sort of read the book without really having any problem. Now, that said, it is almost certain that at various times, various members of the class will have a problem, will not understand something, need more explanation, or whatever, and that is perfectly normal, understandable, and entirely reasonable. And when that happens, please just ask. Ask me, ask the class. We can talk about it in discussion forums. And so, while I'm not going to kind of just give you an overview, really in-depth overview of the readings, I'm going to assume that you've read and that you understand the textbook, because for the most part you should be able to understand the textbook without me having to really give you an in-depth analysis. It's not like we're reading Plato or Aristotle or a work of theory or something. So, all that said, let's take a look at the book, or the readings for the week. So, I asked you to read for this week the prologue and the first two chapters from the Craft of Research. The prologue is subtitled Becoming a Researcher. Chapter 1 is subtitled Thinking in Print. And both offer us a glimpse into the practice of research and who engages in research. We might think of research as a specialized activity performed by experts. We all engage in research. We all act upon that research. And we even at times report our findings to others. The differences between the person trying to figure out which smartphone to buy, a student in a course like this, an investigative journalist, a grandparent trying to reconstruct their family genealogy and history to pass on to their grandchildren, and a Center for Disease Control scientist working to create a Zika vaccine is not that one does research and the others don't. The difference is in the reasons why they're doing research, the amount of time and effort they put into that research, and the methods and resources they use to conduct that research, and the ways in which they will use and report on their findings. In Chapter 1, Thinking in Print, Booth, Cullum, and Williams offer us 4 reasons as to why we might want to write up our research. The first reason they offer is that writing up our research can help us remember what we've discovered. So for instance, a student looking up the half-life of cesium-137 for an oral presentation might want to write it down so they don't have to look it up again in a couple of weeks as they prepare for their talk. Another reason they offer is that writing up our research findings helps us think through an issue or a problem. For instance, someone who's looking to buy a new smartphone might want to create a chart listing all the features that they care about so that they can compare multiple phones from different manufacturers. A third reason they offer is that writing allows us to test our own thinking. An investigative journalist, for instance, might want to write down all the facts they have on their subject to see if the evidence holds together before they pitch an explosive expose that suggests political cover-up to their editors. And finally, the fourth reason they offer to us is that writing a formal report to share, allows us to share our information, share our research findings with others. A CDC scientist, for instance, who is working on the Zika vaccine, might want to write up a formal report, whether it's in the form of a memo to other members of her research team, or a formal lab report that documents how the vaccine was developed so that future researchers might more quickly develop future vaccines for Zika and other related viruses. Finally, they talk about writing as a form of thinking. They argue, in that last part of Chapter 1, that one of the primary benefits of developing our research into a formal piece of writing is that the act of explaining an idea to others often forces us to think through issues and ideas that we might not otherwise explore or develop on our own. So moving on to Chapter 2 of the Craft of Research. Chapter 2 examines how we can connect to our readers by imagining roles for both them and for ourselves. As a researcher sharing your research, you might want to take on the role of a presenter of cool facts that others will find interesting. Maybe you want to take on the role of a problem solver, sharing a solution that you've developed. Or you might want to take on the role of a teacher, sharing information that will help others understand an important issue or a concept better. And just as you might take on the role of a presenter, a problem solver, or a teacher, you might imagine your audience taking on the role of someone looking to be entertained, someone looking for a solution to a problem, or someone interested in learning more about a topic. By understanding your role and the expectations and needs of your audience, you can better figure out what information you should share with your audience and how you want to structure that information so that it is both accessible and understandable so it meets their needs. While reading Chapter 2, or while listening to this lecture, you might, hopefully you've realized that the three roles you might assume as a researcher and the three roles that your audience might play correspond to one another. What's important to note here is that you want to make sure that your intended role and the role your audience's intended role correspond. If you assume that your role is to be a problem solver explaining how to repair 19th century bicycles, while your audience is interested in the history of 19th century bicycling, you and your audience are both going to be disappointed. Which issue you privilege, your role or your audience's role, will depend upon your context. It might be that you decide that you have something you want to share, and so you can choose what role you want to take and what role your audience should take, and then you can choose an appropriate context in which to present that information. It may be, on the other hand, that you are asked to present information, maybe even required to do so, and in that case, you need to figure out what role your audience expects to take, and then you can adjust your role accordingly. So having covered the prologue, Chapter 1 and Chapter 2 from the Craft of Research, I want to shift the rest of this lecture to the issue of disciplinarity. We touched on it already in the introduction to the course lecture when I explained what English 302 is about. And Booth, Coleman, and Williams touch on the issue of disciplinarity as well in the sections we've read from the Craft of Research, although they don't actually use the term. What is disciplinarity? We've used the term a couple times now, but what does it actually mean? If you were to look it up in a dictionary, you might come across a definition of something like of or related to a discipline. Okay. Before we move on to kind of break that down to look at it more closely, I actually think it might be useful to stop for a moment and make the distinction between discipline and field. Sometimes you'll see people use the term discipline, sometimes you'll see people use field, and at times they're entirely interchangeable. In a sort of a general sense, in general terms, they are interchangeable. Discipline and field both essentially mean a branch of knowledge that people study and engage in. However, some people make a distinction between the terms discipline and the terms field, and it's useful to know this. When they use the term when people who do make the distinction between discipline and field, when they use the term discipline, they mean a branch of knowledge that is commonly recognized as its own independent entity. And when they use field, they mean branches of knowledge that are sometimes regarded as part of a larger discipline, or as a new branch of knowledge that does not have universally recognized status. And so for our purposes of this class, we're going to use field and discipline interchangeably. However, it's useful and important to know that some people actually make distinctions. Discipline is a fully recognized field or area, branch of knowledge, area of study, and while field is something that isn't universally recognized, is a kind of a new or emerging area. And to give you some examples, so what these mean is more clear. Branches of knowledge that are commonly accepted as disciplines include things like biology, English, psychology, political science. Branches of knowledge that might be classified as fields, on the other hand, include molecular biology, creative writing, medieval studies, and cognitive science. At some universities, molecular biology and creative writing are their own departments. But in many institutions, molecular biology is seen as a subdiscipline within biology, and creative writing is seen as a subdiscipline within English. Another reason the subject might be viewed as a field rather than a discipline is that it is inherently multidisciplinary, and as such might more commonly represent a loose confederation of practitioners from multiple disciplines who share a common interest than it does an actual discipline itself. Medieval studies, for instance, brings together people from literature, history, philosophy, art history, linguistics, religious studies, archaeology, and even architecture. Cognitive science, as another example, commonly brings together people from psychology, neuroscience, philosophy, artificial intelligence, and linguistics. Now, at times, fields like that, those kind of multidisciplinary fields like medieval studies and cognitive science, they might be represented by something like an institute or a center at a university, or they might actually be their own department, or there may actually not be any sort of formally organized body, but various members of those disciplines, of which, think for medieval studies, people in history, people in philosophy, people in literature, linguistics, religious studies, etc., might actually think of themselves as medievalists who engage in medieval studies. And their research, while they're centered in their home discipline, is often multidisciplinary and interdisciplinary, drawing from a lot of the fields that the medieval studies engages in. And the same with cognitive science. And so again, for our purposes, discipline and field mean the same thing. They mean a branch of knowledge that people study and engage with. And then before we have sort of discipline and field, we'll also talk about, as I use the term subdiscipline, subfield. For instance, again, a way of thinking about this is that subfields of, English studies might include linguistics, literature, medieval literature, 18th century literature, creative writing, etc. Subdisciplines in biology might include molecular biology, environmental biology, social biology, evolutionary biology, etc. Yeah, I think you get the idea there. So, moving on. Before I more fully define disciplinarity, however, and what it means to think about issues of writing and research in terms of disciplinarity, I want to tell you about a joke. I don't want to tell you the joke itself, but I want to tell you about the joke. The joke begins with a doctor, a lawyer, and a police officer who are walking out of a restaurant, and they witness a car accident. And the rest of the joke essentially focuses in on how the three react. The doctor, who's actually an emergency room doctor, immediately runs to the two cars to see if any of the passengers are hurt, and if they need immediate medical attention. The lawyer, who specializes in personal injury lawsuits, kind of evaluates the situation, kind of thinking about who's at fault, identifying which of the drivers is at fault, and then taking a look at how much damage seems to be caused to the car, taking a look at the victim, the person whose car was hit, to see how they seem to be, if they seem to suffered any sort of physical injuries, and then the lawyer sort of evaluates the situation to decide whether or not it might be worth giving the victim her business card, and in doing so sort of note that as a witness to the accident, she's in a good position to help the victim make their case if they want to sue the driver of the car that hit them. Finally, the police officer, who's a detective, begins taking notes, recording details that the investigating police officers may wish to know once they arrive on the scene. Doing such things as noting the time of the accident, the position of the sun, because was the sun possibly involved, like kind of sun in the eyes of the drivers. The police officer the detective takes note of the fact that a soccer ball had actually flown over the schoolyard fence and bounced on the sidewalk and then hit the windshield of the victim's car, and the person whose car was hit, actually hit their brakes, and that they hit the brakes, it seems to be because the soccer ball hit their car. So the thing to note here is that each of these professionals responded to the same exact incident in ways that we might expect them to act based upon their professions. And that should come as no surprise. They are trained professionals. That means that each has specialized knowledge and training based on the practices, values, and methods of their respective professions. And this is true for all of us, for all professionals, and for everyone who works in a discipline. For instance, to be a sociology major, to major in sociology, to major in geology, is to learn to think and work and understand the world as a sociologist or as a geologist. If you think back to the introduction to the course, you might recall that issues of disciplinarity include such issues as the knowledge and inquiry patterns of a discipline, that is, the kinds of questions members of the discipline ask, the kinds of evidence members of the discipline value, and the methods that members of the discipline use, and so on. Disciplinary also governs the discourse practices in the forms of writing and other communication members of that discipline might use to share their knowledge. Disciplinarity also governs such issues as the methods and tools researchers use, the values, assumptions, and biases a researcher might have, and disciplinarity might dictate how common it is for researchers to collaborate and the kinds of collaboration they might engage in. One example of this, we might take a look, one example we might look at to understand disciplinarity differences is to look at the two types of short publications that academics produce. And by short, actually, I mean just a couple pages, sometimes just a few hundred words. One from the sciences and one from the humanities. In the sciences, it's known as the scientific letter, the letter or the scientific letter. And the humanities, it's often this kind of short publication is referred to as a note or a query. Whereas the scientific letter is a short description of current research that is fast-tracked for immediate publication with the understanding that a more detailed, developed research article will follow. The humanities note focuses on a small, even single detail, a discovery or insight that might be important, that is important enough to publish, but it's something that's way too small to actually turn into a regular-sized article. To give an example of the note, a note might actually be something along the lines of a 500-word explanation of how J.R.R. Tolkien, based on his work that he did helping to compile the W section of the Oxford English Dictionary back in the 1920s, how Tolkien got the idea of the ring race from the historical definitions of wreath, wraith, and writhe. And this is actually an actual fact. That's like, yeah, J.R.R. Tolkien actually did that. So, that would be like, just write a little short thing. It's basically a historical fact. You explain it, and it's done. There's not a full essay there. There's not a full article worth of material there. And so you publish it as a note. So unlike the scientific letter, with a note, there is no need for follow-up. The note stands alone. So we can think of the scientific letter actually as like sort of like a teaser announcing research to come. But the note is a final presentation of a research that is on a focused narrow topic. And so you can see there we have two examples of very short publications, one from the sciences, one from the humanities. The purposes of those very short publications are very different. For the sciences, it's to sort of say, hey, we've just discovered this really cool thing, and we're going to tell you more about it. Soon. As soon as we finish the research and we get it, analyze all the data. Whereas a humanities scholar, the note is just a very small, interesting little tidbit of information that doesn't fit and that isn't substantial enough to actually turn into a big article, but is actually worth knowing on its own. Okay, so to wrap up here, I want to give you one last example of how we might think, how disciplinary plays in our practices of writing and research. You can see here I've mentioned in the syllabus that one of the things, my current areas of research is the exploration of creating physical digital texts, combining things with like microcontrollers, such as Arduinos, craft-based electronics, essentially craft-based electronics, uses conductive versions of craft materials such as paint, ink, thread, fabric, tape, and combines them with electronic components, lights, sensors, and the like, and even connecting them using the craft materials to actually connect to computers. So put another way, I make handmade books and I make posters that are meant to be like poster presentations. But what I do is that I actually embed within them electronic components so that they are interactive. So for instance, it might be that by using conductive paint, conductive ink, and other sort of conductive materials, I might actually create a touch sensor so that in a book or in a poster, you can see an example of a poster I made for a conference earlier this summer. You can touch a spot on the book or the poster, and it could even be a word or an image, because conductive ink and conductive paint also work, and that'll make something happen. It might make a light turn on, it might turn on a motor, it might actually call up a web page if the book or poster is connected to a computer, whether wirelessly or using actual physical connections. You can actually, I can have you type something and send out a tweet. It can play audiovisual material, either stuff that's embedded in the book or poster itself, or to a nearby connected computer. And another example, can actually even have a book or a poster communicate with another book or poster. So, that's kind of one of the things that I do. I'm exploring how to do this, what it means to do this, and so I do a number of things, and I ask a number of questions as I, kind of make these things. I play with them, and then I kind of, as I theorize about the construction of these things. And while I have a number of questions, the questions that other people ask me when they hear about my work depends on their field, depends on their disciplinary approaches. So, for instance, when I talk to people in such fields as critical making, digital humanities, and electrical engineering and computer science, they're far more interested in the technical issues of how I'm making these things, the tools I use, how I'm going to create the circuits to connect things together, how I actually have essentially a paper-based electronics interface with a computer. On the other hand, scholars in the fields like composition studies, digital rhetoric, and media studies are far more interested in the kinds of texts that we might be able to make, how those texts might extend our practices with things like multimodal composition, and how they might raise and answer questions about the materiality of texts and how the materiality of texts shape the way in which we can communicate. And so, the questions that I get asked depend on the disciplinary interests, the disciplinary focuses of the people who are asking the questions. And the questions that because I am inherently multidisciplinary, I approach these things with multiple questions and multiple perspectives at the same time, but I focus on different things at different times because I'm using different methods, different ideas, different questions as I do things. For instance, I make this stuff. When I make this stuff, I'm actually coming at it from a digital humanities critical making perspective. When I think about what I've made and what the potential it has, I'm coming at it more from my kind of computers and writing digital rhetoric perspective. And when I think about the materiality of the text, I'm coming at it from sort of the digital rhetoric and from my sort of media studies perspective. And so, my different disciplines, my different disciplinary foci lead me to ask different questions at different times in the process of making these things. Okay, if you have any questions, again, please ask in the forums. We've got the week 1 forum specifically for questions, and thank you.